Let's put some muscles on the body. Now, I've already built the armature and I've already built the skeleton for this pose. I'll open those up first. So here is the armature of the pose, showing its directions, showing its perspective with the ellipses. The feet are on the ground plane. This ellipse should be here because the leg is moving forward. We want to see how much of the leg is distorting the interior of the torso core. Then we have the skeleton. And then we have the skeleton of the pose. The skeleton of the pose is the foundation. This is where all the muscles are going to be attached. So everything needs to be fairly clear. If I get really sketchy with this stage, it's going to make things messy for the next stage. So I'm looking for something clean, something simple and geometric. Geometry is important here, especially when it comes to places like the rib cage, where we need to be able to define plane structures within the spherical shape that we started with. And we know that the rib cage and the skull are both egg-like when we begin, like elliptical egg-like shapes. But that's just the foundation point. When we get into the actual structure of it, they're nothing like a sphere. They just resemble one in their quick read. Everything else beyond that is nuanced and very plane driven. And that's what we're seeking out here. I tend to begin with the core of the pose when blocking out the muscle structure. I think it's important to have a foundation. The arms and the legs are attached to the core, so we begin in the center of the figure to establish a solid connection for the limbs and everything else to attach. This is not an anatomy course where I'm going to be explaining what each muscle does. It's more like an anatomy design course where we're going to look at how to quickly put it all together. Right around in here, things are going to be a little bit different than the geometry of the model. The opening of my volume here is a little bit wider, and that's fine. The abdominal wall has layers to it. There's 3 layers in the abdominal wall. And one of those layers, the one that the muscles are attached to, the middle layer, if you will, the muscles are in the center, and then there's a layer above and a layer below. This is a cross section. The abdominal muscles sit in the middle. In the écorché, what we normally see as an anatomy person isn't really designed that way. Most of the muscles, like on the hips, the gluteus medius is completely covered up by fascia. So is the scapula, but we take those covers off so that we can read the muscles, as especially as artists. All right, so the core has design to it where these muscles kind of blend together. You have the bottom edge of the pectoralis muscle that cuts off the abdominal muscles from going any further up. But the abdominal portion of the pectoralis, which is this little finger over off to the side, and the abdominal wall sort of blend together. And then you have the obliques that travel up underneath the pectoralis muscle and come from the hips out here. But when we draw these things out, everything looks completely flat, but the reality of this volume is something more like this, where we have forward approaching volume. Things are turning corners and moving closer to the camera, and that's the cross-section drawing that you want to get more involved with. Cross sections are so important when you're only studying on your own and you don't have the model to work with, because the cross sections are going to tell you how to see these shapes more three-dimensionally. The front view and the back view and the side view tell you something about their geometry, but the cross section tells you its volume. The little finger muscles, as they come from the scapula, I want to draw them from above, right? I want to draw them from up here so they feel like they're descending, which I think is a mistake that most artists make. They put them in parallel to each other when they're actually tumbling down from the scapula. Then there's the latissimus muscle that sits just to the outside of the serratus muscles. It sits over the top of them and covers them up to some extent, especially towards the bottom. It's, I think, what you call the wing muscle. At least that's what I've heard it described as, is the wing muscle. Get rid of these older lines here. This muscle comes forward and attaches to the front of the arm. Comes forward like so, just underneath that muscle. Comes around like this. Then down below, we solve the hip muscles, and then we're going to solve the shoulder muscles. So we have the core in here. We could also, let's actually, first of all, before I move on, I'm going to build the striations in here. So these are the abdominal striations, and they sit within this middle tract between these two edges, which are all fascia. Fascia is like a leathery material, and that material is what anchors these muscles to other muscles and to the bone structure. Just above all of this, we have the trapezius muscles, and we can use the rhythms found on both of these pectoralis muscles as a way of creating the yoke shape that goes up and around the neck. Then, from the edges of the acromion processes out here, we take those up into the back, and those resemble a coat hanger shape. That's what we're putting in within this upper space. And all of this is muscle, all of this is muscle. From under the ear, you have the sternocleidomastoideus muscles. These come down and attach to the sternum, thus the name sterno. Cleido, clavicle. So then we have part of it coming out here and attaching to the clavicle. And what part of it? Well, if we take the length of the clavicle bone and we divide this into thirds, it's this first third right here, or in this case over here, the first third right here. And that gives us a rough estimation of the volume and how far over it's attached. All of this is more open. There's muscles further in there, but then there's a big tendon that comes down off of the corner of the mouth, along the jaw, down along the shoulder line, and this is called the platysma. This covers up all of those holes. We don't see that as a muscle, though. But when somebody strains their neck, you might see all these little ribbons of flesh that look like they're little striations, and that's the platysma stretching. Then we have the shoulders and the hips. So the shoulders, the deltoid comes down and attaches to this bump. I'm only going to put in this first line. I'm going to do the crossover line once I put the bicep in. Down here, we have the gluteus medius, which we'd started. The tensor fascia, lata, a little teardrop shape, and you can basically attach that to this circle for now, and then later we're going to attach it more specifically. And then the gluteus maximus muscle, we might be seeing just a hint of it over on this side. Moving down through the leg, we have the quadricep muscles, and we need to think about these two bumps right along the iliac crest now. And the second bump below is where part of the teardrop shape of that muscle comes from. So we have this teardrop shape in here. It swings over towards this bone, the great trochanter, and you could draw it all the way down underneath the kneecap just to get the shape of it correct. If you see the length of the leg, you could also take this up this way. So we have a line coming from up here, then we have the bump over here. The rectus femoris is coming from this spot right here, and that's the topmost muscle of the quadricep that sits right along in here. Do the same thing over on this side. Draw like a long cigar shape and then flatten this end out. And that end is going to become a tendon that comes down and attaches to the kneecap and then attaches below the kneecap, which is why you drew this big teardrop shape below the kneecap. Do the same thing over on this side. Then the vastus lateralis, that's all of this space over here. It comes up towards this bump, the great trochanter. It attaches all along here, and then it becomes part of the tendon that's heading down underneath the kneecap. Do the same thing over on this side. Then the vastus medialis, which is along in here, does the same thing. It comes from the inside of the femur bone, then swings upward and attaches to this tendon that sits below the kneecap, or is anchored below the kneecap. Those three muscles make up the quadricep. Then sitting over the top of the quadricep, running down along here like a belt and attaching to the front of the tibia, we have the iliotibial tract. You can see that from the profile view of the model. Coming from this top bump up here, we have the sartorius. Part of the sartorius covers up the rectus femoris, then the rest of it spins underneath and attaches to the tibia down here. It goes underneath the vastus medialis, so it doesn't actually cover that muscle up. Comes down along like so, and that one disappears behind the leg. And then I'm going to draw a line down the middle here, which splits both of the legs, and then actually I could go three. Three little lines on both sides, and those are the adductor muscles. A very quick and easy fill for those. For the calf muscle group, I'm going to start this off with the bowling pin shape. On the inside edge, the bump or the widest point of it sits low, while on the outside edge, the widest point of it sits up high over here. Now to render into this space, I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer, and I'm going to shrink the brush that I'm using so that I don't end up making such wide lines, because I really do need all the space I can get within these little areas. The shin bone is drawn along here. I have the curve on the inside of the bone shape, which the front of your shin bone does sweep like so. Then next to that curve, and I'm also going to expose this front right along here. So this is all exposed shin bone. On this side, we have the same thing right along in here. The gastrocnemius sits up top, then the soleus, and then just below the soleus, we have the flexor muscles. So those three sets of muscles sit within this space. The gastrocnemius is coming from behind the femur. Part of it you can see over on this side, which I have to clean up a little bit over here if we are going to see anything at all. So this is where lines and the line thickness comes into play. If the line thickness gets too thick, then you run out of room for all the little subtlety things. This muscle right here goes underneath into the arch of the foot and extends down into the first four toes. So that's the flexor for the toes. On the other side over here, we see the gastrocnemius like we do over here. Both of those are one muscle that comes down and attaches to the heel, and you call all that the Achilles tendon. The soleus sits just underneath that and is a part of the Achilles tendon. We can see a hint of it over here. Then you have the peroneus longus and brevis, the extensor digitorum longus, and then the tibialis anterior. There's 5 muscles on that outside. The tibialis anterior crosses into the arch over here. The extensor muscle comes down and spreads out to the first 4 toes, just like the flexor group. And the pinky toe has its own muscles on the outside edge of the foot. So we have 5 here, 3, 4, 5. We have 3 over here. 2 of those are the same on both sides, gastrocnemius and soleus. I'll have these colored in just a moment. Do the same thing over on the other side. I'm going to draw in the bowling pin shape. I'm going to bring this down, subdivide, subdivide. And we have these 3 little spaces right along in here. This last one here goes under the arch. The tibialis anterior over here goes over the arch, then into the arch interior. Then we have the extensor muscles, and those come down to the first 4 toes. So that helps us with our shape language down in here, filling it in, and we're using those basic shapes to start with, and then we fill them up very quickly. And then I'll do one of the arms for you. Since both of the arms are identical, I really only need to finish one of these. The brachialis sits here. The bicep sits over the top of that. The coracobrachialis sits right along in here. Behind all of that is the tricep, which attaches to the elbow. We have the ridge muscles, or the supination muscles, which come off of this part of the bone over here. We have the pronator teres, and then all of the flexor muscles, which come off of this bump right over here. Those become tendons and go out to the fingertips. The thumb muscles are on the top of the arm, and those head out into the ends of the thumb, the pollicis muscles. And then along these, you're going to see tendons, and these are all coming from the extensor muscles, while these, the flexor muscles, are going into the interior of the palm to attach to the fingertips inside of there. This is how all of the muscles are grouped together. If I wanted to draw this space very quickly, I would do this shape. Remember the 2 cups that are attached to each other. Up here is half a spinning top or radish. Down here is that bowling pin shape. And that's the quick block in. Once that big space has been established, everything else is a detail that sits within that. But it begins with the biggest shapes first. I wouldn't do any of this starting with one little muscle and then attaching another one next to it. Before you know it, all of those muscles will start spreading out and become something much larger that you can contain within the figure space. This micromanages all the shapes by having a simple geometry to begin with and then filling that geometry. Obviously, the edges are going to change a little bit as you add each muscle group in, but that simple geometry helps you get established. It starts you off in a space, and then from there, everything is about organization of your design. Any other little bits of design that we put in here now, as we put them in, we want to understand the plane structure because that's how we're going to shade, which is the next step after this.